By now, you know that Tim and I are big fans of the Pillars of Influence, those ideas researched and curated by Robert Cialdini and his colleagues and made popular in the book Influence. Now, that book was first published back in 2006 and has sold millions of copies and is widely regarded as one of the most important books in the behavioral science catalog. And we encourage you to read that, but we also encourage you to learn more about Robert Cialdini and his work, which you can find in our conversations with him from episode 50 way back in 2019, episode 226 from May of 2021. And we also want to alert you to something that he did for the application of behavioral science.
Yeah, so several years ago, Cialdini founded a group of close-knit associates to expand his ideas and his reach into applications. He called this inner circle Influence at Work. Now, we've heard from two of those inner circle people in the past episodes. First, we talked to Brian Ahern. We talked to him in 2018 and 2019 in episodes 39 and 89. And the second person from that inner circle is Steve Martin. Now, we first met Steve when he released the absolutely wonderful book on the messenger effect. And that was in episode 110 back in January of 2020.
Yeah, The Messenger Effect, or The Messenger is the Message, is a terrific book that we highly recommend, particularly these days when we see how much sway powerful influencers have over many of our opinions and our beliefs.
Yeah. And in addition to his work with Cialdini, Steve is also the faculty director of behavioral science at Columbia Business School and co-author of several international bestsellers, including Yes, 50 Secrets from the Science of Persuasion. He's also the chair of one of the founding members of GABS, the Global Association of Applied Behavioral Scientists, which we're kind of fans of because we're members.
Yeah, well, you are. There we go. We invited Steve back to discuss his latest book, Influence at Work, Capture Attention, Connect with Others, and Convince People to Act. This book was published by The Economist, and in it, he peels back the layers of research and boils down thousands and thousands of papers to get to the heart of it. How can we ethically use the principles of persuasion in our work lives? And why would we do that? Steve has a great explanation.
You'll be hard-pressed to find a job description that doesn't have the word influence or persuade or connect or convince in it somewhere. It's the currency of a workplace. We shouldn't be hiding behind it. We should be understanding how we can be good agents for it. And to be good agents for it and to be good practitioners of it and effective and ethical agents of it, our job is not to know everything about it. Our job is to understand and be able to practice the essentials of it.
Welcome to Behavioral Grooves, the podcast that explores our human condition. I'm Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. Steve's continued efforts allowed us to focus our discussion on some very important aspects of using influence in the office. We started out by talking about the influence equation, which is the combined application of evidence, economics, and emotion in order to be persuasive. He uses a cool metaphor to help show how these get used for different effects, too.
Yeah, and you're not going to share that metaphor. People are going to have to listen, huh?
Have to listen.
Right. Steve also gave some great examples on how to apply the influence equation, along with some practical advice to make the best of them. And most importantly, he reinforced that applying this equation at work isn't about knowing every detail, but it's about trying it out and using it to see what works best for you in your particular situation.
So with that, Groovers, we invite you to sit back and relax with a glass of freshly squeezed influence and enjoy our conversation with Steve Martin. Steve Martin, welcome back to Behavioral Grooves.
Well, it's lovely to be here. It's good to hear from you, Tim. Kurt, always a pleasure.
It really is a pleasure, and it's really great to have you back in. And the first time we talked, actually the last time we talked on the podcast was, right before the pandemic. So
right.
We've got some new speed round questions for you, and we're going to start with, would you prefer to have dinner with your favorite actor or favorite musician?
I think favorite musician.
You just made Tim very happy.
Good
That's
call.
all I have to say.
Good call. Let me just say that was the correct answer.
Should we stop now?
Yeah, exactly.
We're done.
I think we're done.
You scored. We're good. There we go. All right, second speed round question. Imagine if you could have any superpower for an hour, just an hour, what would that superpower be?
Invisibility.
What? Okay.
Nice.
Why?
Nice.
Why invisibility? What would you do with it?
I don't know. The devilish person within me would be, I just want to kind of go in and just move a few things around in people's rooms just to kind of like think about it.
Oh, that would be so.
I put my keys here, but they're not there anymore. Okay.
They're floating across the room. Oh my gosh. There you go.
Okay. Third speed round question. If you could be in the studio for the recording of any one record, just a fly on the wall, which record would you want to be in the studio for? And throughout history, right? This is not that's being recorded literally right now, but any record throughout history, which record would you have wanted to be in the studio for?
Well, I'm going to say New Order's Blue Monday.
Ooh, I
know
like
you
that.
asked me about my music choices before, and they haven't changed that much. But there's just something about. So that was my era. I was a new student at the time. Blue Monday came out. It went on to be, and still is, I believe, the best-selling 12-inch single of all time. And following what happened with Kurt and Joy Division, and then
I was going to say with Joy Division, that was pretty soon after that, right?
It was, and I still believe it's actually. I think I'm right in saying this. It's one of still the most sampled records for new music. It's timeless. It's classic. It would have been interesting to be in there thinking about not only what the output of that disc and that song was, but the context in which they actually recorded it after, the lead singer of, what was essentially Joy Division, arguably the most instrumental and influential of the electronic acts of the early 1980s. They lose their lead singer and they reform and they bring that out. That must have been, wow.
Pretty amazing. And they reformed with the same members. It was literally that, all right, we're going to take this over and we're going to become the singer and songwriters that I think they lost. So
we
all
are
right.
The New Order.
Yeah, that New Order. There you go. Okay. Last speed round question. Why write a book about influence when we know everything we need to know about influence already?
I know, it's crazy, right? And the answer is, I didn't want to write another book. So I really didn't. And,
wait, isn't writing a book just like the most joyful and pleasant experience you could ever imagine?
It's just bliss, Tim. It's absolute bliss. And you see all these reports of people go, they announce on LinkedIn, I've just signed a contract to write my new book, and I'm so excited. And everybody weighs in, they go, congratulations, this, that, and the other. And
absolutely euphoric. Yeah.
Oh my God, you poor thing. You just have, I think, Kurt, you said this before once, no one, I don't think, well, actually, that's not true. I'm sure there's lots of people that like writing, and I actually enjoy writing, but the whole process of writing a book is just so extraordinarily tiring. It's just exhausting. It's hard. Yeah. You get up at 5 a.m. in the morning, you're trying to will words onto the screen, and you eventually write a few things, and then you come back an hour later, read it and go, well, that's rubbish. And you kind of start over. And here's the nice thing, having written a book is great fun.
So what's new? Tell us about, if we already know, don't we already know everything there is to know about influence? I mean, books, you have written books about it already. So
with the godfather of influence, Bob Cialdini, co-authoring, which was a fantastic book. So what is new in the world of influence that you would possibly write an entire book on? Well,
this is the other reason why I was struggling to say yes to Claire initially, because, what can I say that's actually new when I think it's been said? And by the way, this is not just, the books that have been written about influence in the last 10, 15, 20 years. Influence this year, 2024, is celebrating its 40th anniversary. So it's 4 decades old. And you go back to 1936, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, which still regularly appears in the top 100 best-selling books, not just business books, but all books.
Yeah.
And then, I know a little bit about this topic. I know about the history, both in terms of Roman influence, but going back actually into the Egyptian and the ancient Chinese times as well. One of the first books ever written, Maxims, was essentially a book about social influence. So I don't think I really set out to say what's new. I think what I set out to do in this book is to provide some order and actually take away the things that don't matter so much. If we're in a situation where there is so much information and data and evidence about something, I think sometimes what can be more helpful is, rather than adding to that body, is actually taking stuff away and almost presenting an idea so complex and so socially intertwined, like how to influence and persuade people, which, by the way, every single one of us needs as a skill, regardless of our role, the job we actually do. What can I take away and how can I provide some order to it? And so what we do in this book is I set forward a simple idea, which is anyone can craft a strategy, an approach, an appeal, a presentation that will be a more influential and persuasive one by using a simple equation, thinking about influence in terms of the evidence, the economics, and the emotion that I put into my message or my appeal. And so the influence equation is what I'm calling it. I'm basically saying anyone can do this. But what's interesting is that the amount of evidence, the amount of economics, the amount of emotion that you put into your appeal will differ depending on the context. But it will never, ever be equal amounts. It's never a third, a third, a third. And the metaphor I use is kind of like primary colors. When we were in art school, we learned that we could create numerous different colors by different quantities and combinations of the primary colors of blue, red, and yellow. And the same is true when it comes to influence. All of us can be a little bit more influential and successful, craft a good strategy, a good approach, get people to say yes to us a little bit more by thinking about how we make our requests by using that combination of evidence, economics, and emotions. Or put another way, successful influence is all about the right combination of facts, finances, and feelings.
Yeah. So the title of the book is Influence at Work,
yeah.
But it almost sounds as if this is influence in general. Is there a specific aspect about this that you're writing about for people who are at work, or does the insights that you bring in this order that you talked about and the equation apply across? Doesn't matter if I'm at work or if I'm at home or if I'm in my, out with my friends. How does that fit in?
Well, it is very much the latter there, Kurt. A couple of reasons why we call it influence at work. One is that Bob Cialdini and Minds Consulting Company is also called Influence at Work. And so when the Economist is willing to put, your name and your company logo on their book, I'm not going to say no to that.
That's a good combination. Yeah.
But there's also, two ways of interpreting influence at work. It could be influence in the workplace, or it could be how influence works. What are the component parts of it that you need to know about in order for it to work for you? And so for that reason, although work appears in the title, and I suspect, when we think about influence and persuasion, a lot of people's minds go to how they can be more effective in the workplace, with their colleagues, their clients, stakeholders, these different kind of things. The fact of the matter is that anyone can use this influence equation. And actually, many people do. In fact, a number of people that have commented on early drafts of the book and that have actually given some really nice endorsements for it aren't just people in the workplace. They're people that run charities.
Mm-hmm.
They're people that actually, there are some people that are running the countries. I have people that work in Congress that have commented on it. Academics have, journalists, and then, people like all of us who work in the applied behavioral science community as well. And so I think that probably illustrates the reach and the appeal is quite broad.
Yeah. You're writing about the rules of influence, and some all that matter, right? But there are some that rarely get talked about. And I'm curious if you could share with us, what are the rules that you think are not getting talked about enough, especially within this evidence and economics and emotion breakdown? What's not getting enough airplay, so to speak?
Well, I think one of them, Tim, this is a great question. I think one of them is this idea that we often find ourselves in a situation where We have all the tools at our disposal to win the argument. We have the data, we have the evidence, we have the numbers. But we still go into these situations and we fail to win the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there is a very real difference between knowing how to win an argument and what needs to happen in order for the outcome to be the one that is optimal for everyone concerned. And, a good example, I think, is our own industry, the applied behavioral science. So, psychologists, social psychologists, economists, neuroscientists, these kind of things. I've noticed over these last 10, 12 years in particular, as it's become much, much more prominent. And, we're building units in organizations and governments to apply behavioral insights, that we've taken a very, very heavy focus, rightly so, on the evidence, the data. We're doing more and more studies, more and more research. But what's really interesting to me about when people present evidence is it's never the evidence by itself that wins the outcome. It's never the evidence by itself. In fact, there's very little evidence that supports the idea that evidence alone is a good mechanism for influence and change. It's always what we compare the evidence to, or what that evidence or data gets compared to, that matters. Or, in a kind of link back to previous work that I've spoken to you about, sometimes it's not the evidence, but who presents it.
Yeah.
Or how much evidence we actually present. I think this needs to be stated. It's an obvious observation, but I don't think we talk about it enough, that we live in an information-laden world. If we want information about something, data, evidence, we can find it. We can find it with the swipe of a screen, a click of a button. It's all there for us. What I find interesting is how in an information-rich world, we seem to be using less and less of it to be making increasingly important decisions.
Oh, I think that's fantastic. And the thought behind how we use these three, as you talked about, evidence, economics and emotion, and the combination of those and various different things. Can you help us think through? So I'm working right now with an organization, and one of the pieces in this organization I'm working with, really bright, immensely qualified researchers who are brilliant, absolutely brilliant. But then they have to take this research and convince others within the organization who are not researchers that this line of this, whatever their research points out to, makes this implication, and we need to do this as an organization. And they run into a problem because they're really good at conveying and showing how this research impacts other research, with other researchers.
Yeah.
They're not as good at doing that with the commercial arm of the organization, the executives who are not part of the research team. So how do all these pieces fit together? And is that one of the things that you're seeing in instances like that?
This is a really interesting question. And, I work with a lot of academics. I've got I've got a lot of super bright people that work for me as well. And we all face this challenge too. And I think a starting point, Kurt, is to recognize that the person that I'm about to present to or share my idea with or present my proposition isn't like me, okay? I might have all the data. I might be the most knowledgeable person on this subject, but I don't have to actually get them to my level of understanding and the intricacy of, the different component parts and what the evidence is saying and what it's not, because their goal is different to mine. And so if I take this approach that I can inform you into influence, and the person I'm trying to inform into influence isn't either interested or doesn't have the either the motivation or the capability to kind of understand at a level that I do, I have to meet them. The task isn't for them to come to meet me.
Right.
Okay, so that's the starting point. And then that's where I think this equation really becomes super helpful, because what it does is it says to the influencer, there are so many things you can say to present your evidence. There are so many ways in which you could create some economic strategy or financial incentives. There are so many ways in which you could create an emotional appeal. There's hundreds, thousands of them. Forget about all those. Just focus on these three things. And I'll give you a really, I think, illustrative example of this. And it was actually this morning I was talking to a couple of pretty well-known behavioral scientists, and they're saying, we find behavioral science a pretty tough sell sometimes. We find it a pretty tough sell. We have all these insights. We show how we can be more effective in our organization, how we can create efficiencies, how we can improve our sales effectiveness, how we can do this, that, and the other. Why are people kind of embracing this? Well, it's because no one phones you up and says, hey, I want to buy behavioral science. People are interested in how I increase my sales effectiveness, how I get better trust in my organization, how I get improved collaboration, how I get people to vote for me if I'm, running for office or the presidency, or these kind of things. So the way that we talk about behavioral science and influence is very different to the way that the people that buy it talk about it. And I think that's another important point here. And I don't know why we haven't figured this out, because we're smart people that know about the psychology of influence and persuasion, right? We should be meeting people and our audience at that level. And that requires us to, essentially back to this point that I mentioned earlier, we don't have to win the argument to win the outcome. We can just win the outcome. Put another way, would you rather be right about something, or would you rather be effective at something?
Yeah. This is a great part of the conversation, and I'm really glad that you're addressing it. And I'm wondering if you can give an example of the difference between the way we might talk about influence in a behavioral science way versus the way a marketer, for instance, might be wanting to talk about influence, or someone in HR, or something like that. Could you give us an example, Steve?
Yeah, I can. So let's talk about. Well, okay, this is a music-infused podcast, so I'm going to go a little bit Swifty.
You have just made Tim happy. There
Perfect.
you go.
Yes.
All right. So she has this new album out. What is it? The Tortured Poets Society or something. Okay, let's talk about the Tortured Social Norm Society.
Okay. All right.
Because we seem to be obsessed with kind of social norms, social proof, these kind of things, and we talk about it, we explain it, where it was, this and the other. That's us kind of talking about a really interesting and very significant influence on human conduct and behavior and these kind of things. Mm-hmm. But if you're a marketeer, you're not talking about that. You're actually talking about, how do I improve my market share, or how do I position my product in such a way that I can be seen as perhaps differentiated from my competitor, and these kind of things. Right. And our job in those instances is to say to these people, we have ways in which we can actually help you that will deliver these outcomes. We don't need to go in and start to wax lyrical about the difference between a descriptive social norm and an injunctive social norm, or a dynamic norm, or these kind of things. And I wonder if this is going to be a little controversial here, but I wonder whether sometimes we may hide behind this behavioral science discipline, because it strikes me that a lot of the things that we're trying to do when we're applying behavioral science is we're trying to sell more stuff, we're trying to influence people, we're trying to, win a competitive advantage, a market share, differentiation. And the problem with words like sales and influence and differentiation and persuasion is they come with that potential shadow of manipulation, salesy, snake oily. And these aren't words that we want to kind of be associated with. Those are for other people. And so I wonder sometimes whether what behavioral science does is it gives us a rather convenient kind of mask or cloak or disguise to wear that actually is really, in a way, diverting attention away from what we're really trying to do, which is we want to engage people because we want to influence and persuade them to do something.
Right.
I think the conflict here, Tim and Kurt, is that we're kind of talking about roughly the same thing, but we're using very, very different terms for it. And the terms that we're actually using sometimes, and hiding behind our science and our evidence, allow us to kind of maybe remove ourselves from being an accomplice to those kind of outcomes.
Yeah.
But we're still charging people money to do so. And that strikes me as perhaps, I don't know about whether that's wholly authentic or not. Right?
It's interesting when you bring up this idea that we are using the language of behavioral science to do the same things that a marketer will do without engaging with that language, because, and I'll use kind of, if I can summarize what you said, because it makes us feel a little dirty, right? It kind of, it feels like I don't want to be associated with that. I think that's an interesting take. And I think there's a kernel of truth, at least underneath there for at least myself. I know, if somebody asks me what I do, most of the work that I do is actually working around incentives and sales. I mean, that's the main work that we do. But I'm a behavioral scientist. I bring science to this. I am not, I'm not the sales incentive person. So I think there's a kernel of truth underneath that. And I think it is important for us to understand that, particularly as behavioral scientists, are we hiding? Are we doing this just for that reason? Or should we take on and just accept that this idea that it's not bad. It isn't bad to have salespeople motivated to go out there and sell more, and partly because of the economics of it, but partly because of the emotion and the other factors that go into this. So,
yeah, that is a perspective that I will agree with. And I'd add something, actually, which is one of the things I talk about early on in the book is I like LinkedIn, okay? You guys like LinkedIn. A lot of us are registered on LinkedIn. I don't necessarily use it lots, but there's one thing I do use it for. I use it as a barometer, because there are so many hundreds of millions of people that are registered on LinkedIn that are sharing information about, what they got up to at work, the downside of working for this person and the crazy stuff that their colleagues get up to. And it's a really, really nice barometer for what's going on right now in the workplace. And they do all sorts of surveys. There's one survey I like. They ask a single question, okay? And the question is, what is the most important skill that you require in your workplace right now? Okay. And they've been asking this question for 16, 17 years now. And as you can imagine, over these 16 or 17 years, the kind of things that are important in workplaces are going to be different. Okay. And these are, by the way, all workplaces, so all industries. So it's not just like big banks or big oil or public service and public sector government organizations. It's small businesses, it's entrepreneurs, it's, mom and pop stores, all these different kind of things. They all contribute. Okay. And so back in 2007, 2008, when they first started the survey, one of the most important skills actually in the kind of top 5 or top 10 was how do I write a tweet? I mean, that sounds so quaint now, doesn't it? Doesn't it sound so? Now people are going, how do I write a prompt for Chat GPT-4 that will probably take my job at some point? It's like, wow. So the ebbs and flows of the workplace and the business, they change over time. But here's one thing, Tim and Kurt, that I don't think is going to surprise you at all. And it didn't surprise me. There is one skill that never, ever falls out of the top 5 desirable skills in workplaces around the world, from offices to factories to whatever it is. And it's influence. You'll be hard-pressed to find a job description that doesn't have the word influence or persuade or connect or convince in it somewhere. It's the currency of a workplace. We shouldn't be hiding behind it. We should be understanding how we can be good agents for it. And to be good agents for it and to be good practitioners of it and effective and ethical agents of it, our job is not to know everything about it. Our job is to understand and be able to practice the essentials of it.
Yeah.
And that's my observation.
Yeah.
And hence this influence equation. 3 simple things. Okay. Yeah. If you want to be more influential, think about the facts, think about the feelings, think about the finances, but recognize that in every situation it's going to be slightly different and it's never, ever going to be equal.
Yeah.
For instance, you're going to have to, double down on this as opposed to this.
Yeah. I like what you said there, that this idea of having the influence component as part of every job. And we've talked with Bob Cialdini a couple different times, your co-author of Yes, and kind of the godfather of all this. And what you just said reminded me of some of the conversations that we had with him. Is think about going through our daily lives. We often put this negative connotation on influence, persuasion, any of those types of words. But it's what we're doing when we're talking with our kids to try to get them to empty out the dishwasher, when we're going, to our community organization and we want to get a stop sign put in on the side of on our street, or a stoplight, or whatever it would be. We have to convince, we have to influence, we have to persuade. And we shouldn't think about it as a negative connotation. We should be thinking about it positively. Hey, this is Kurt, and we want to say thanks for listening to Behavioral Grooves. And we hope that you're enjoying this episode, but it feels a little bit one-sided. You're hearing from us, but we're not hearing from you.
This is Tim, and we have 2 suggestions to remedy that. The first is join our Facebook page and engage with us.
We want to talk with you. We want to hear your perspectives, and hopefully our Facebook page might be the place to have some of that interaction. So please come and join us.
The other recommendation we have for you is to leave us a quick rating. You know, the little 5-star thing at the bottom of your app? Or a short review. Just leave us a few words about what you like about Behavioral Grooves. We'd very much appreciate it.
Thanks, and we now return you to our regularly scheduled programming.
We are talking with Steve Martin about his latest book, Influence at Work. And Steve, you've been working with Bob Cialdini. Thank you for that. You've been working with Bob Cialdini for many, many years. He's been hailed as one of the greatest behavioral scientists because his research has such practical implications. Yeah. But I'm wondering, what do you think are his two most important research contributions?
I think the first is that he made a decision very early on in his career to get out of the laboratory.
Field work, field experiments.
I love Bob. Okay. As you rightly say, Bob and I have been working together, it's 22, 23 years now. Yeah, wow. He's not just a colleague. It's kind of family. You know, I went to his son's wedding. He came to our wedding, and this, I speak to him most weeks, and I see him, 3 or 4 times a year, and these kind of things. And he's not a great joke teller.
Let that be noted.
But I remember once him telling me this joke, right? And it goes along the lines, I can't remember all the details, but he says, this guy comes out of a bar and he's walking along the sidewalk, and there's this other chap on his hands and knees on the pavement underneath a street light, and he's scrabbling around. And this guy turns around to him and says, What are you doing? He said, I'm looking for my car keys. I've dropped my car keys. And so this guy gets down on his hands and knees, and he starts looking around as well. And they're scrabbling around, and 2 or 3 minutes later, they're like, I'm sorry, I don't think your car keys are here. And then you do the obvious thing when someone's lost something. The really annoying question that people ask is, well, where did you see it last, right?
Yeah.
Right. I knew that. He said, and this guy turned around and he says, well, I do remember that I had them over there. I think I dropped them over there. And the guy says, well, why are you looking here then? And he said, well, the light's better over here.
Yeah.
Now that's a really terrible joke.
It's a dad joke. It is a perfect dad joke.
But here's the point. What Bob then says is, he says, actually, that describes academic research sometimes.
Yes.
We go into the laboratory where all the lights are bright. We can shine the lens on whatever we want, and we can be purely focused on that. But life doesn't live in a laboratory. Life is outside. Life is, I'll give you an example. One of my colleagues, Eloise Copland, she runs our kind of climate change, sustainability practice, these kind of things, right? She just published this paper in Harvard, actually. Bob and I helped her with. She's done a 4-year program of change in agriculture in Southeast Asia, okay? We can't get this published. And the reason we can't get it published in an academic peer-reviewed journal is because over the course of 4 years, we ended up doing about 25 things to engage and influence, in this case, farmers to reduce their fertilizer use, to stop their crop burning at the end of harvests and turnovers and these kind of things, right? So all we can say in our report is we've had this impact over 4 years, and these are the things that we think have had a major contribution to it. But we can't prove it. And that is essentially the first thing that Cialdini, I think, has brought to this discipline, and why he absolutely rightly deserves his position as one of the founding fathers of applied behavioral science is he brought a real-world focus to what is a real-world activity. And subsequently wrote Influence, which I know all of us have read and probably multiple times, and for some of us has actually been life-changing, including myself, because, I end up kind of working and studying with the guy and these kind of things. So that's the first thing he's actually brought. And I think aligned to that is the second thing, which is a pragmatism, a practicality to things. And it kind of comes full circle back to the point that we were talking about a few moments ago, which is we don't have to win the argument to win the outcome.
Yes.
We don't have to change people's minds in order to kind of influence their decisions and their actions. And in fact, actually trying to do so often just pisses them off. And this is essentially what Bob is actually doing, is he's actually saying, would we rather be right about something, or would we rather be effective about something? And we've gotten to this point now where we've got so much stuff that we're right about. I think we're starting to become ineffective as a result of this. And if this book is a manifesto for anything, it's actually not for adding things, it's for taking things away.
So let's dig down that hole, or that line of thought a little bit more. What do you hope your readers take away? What is that thing that you want them to take away after reading this?
What I'd like them to take away, Kurt, is a simple approach and tool to a job, a task, an endeavor that all of us face, which is, how do I influence this person to accept my idea? How do I persuade my management team to give me the budget for this project? How do I, whatever that case may be, persuade my patient to take their drugs, whatever the case may be. When I'm tasked with that challenge, which is hard, by the way, influencing and persuading people is really hard. Okay, let's be honest. Here's what I want them to take away. In planning my approach, I need to think about three things. First of all, I need some facts, okay? But what I need to recognize is it's not the facts themselves that is going to convince this person or this group. It's what I compare the facts to. It's who delivers those facts and how many facts I give. And the advice is clear. It's never more than three. And there's tons and tons of research now that shows that, anytime you need to kind of provide any more evidence above three, you actually do a pretty good job of increasing skepticism for that particular idea. Okay, so that's the first thing, right? So I can do that. Now let's think about the finances of the situation. Okay, money matters, of course, right? Clinton famously said it's the economics, stupid, right? But actually, it's not just the economics stupid, it's how the economics are framed, right? We did this experiment with New York bus drivers. This happened since the last time I spoke to you, okay? Turns out that, all of us want to persuade bus drivers to drive a little bit more safely, right? So the way they do that is they encourage them to leave what they call a safe following distance between the front of their bus and the vehicle that's traveling in front, okay? And the ideal industry standard is minimum of 2 seconds, right? How do you get bus drivers to do that in New York? Well, there's a simple way to do it. Pay them, right? Just pay them, right? But the way you pay them matters more than what you pay them, okay? So what we found was, we say, drive safely, do this following distance wherever you can. We've got sensors, we've got video, we can capture the data. And if you get to a certain KPI at the end of the month, you get $100. Okay, turns out that worked quite well. What works better is if you pay them $25 a week.
Mm-hmm.
Same $100. So that when you think about a persuasive appeal or an influence strategy, the finances matter, but it's not the finances themselves. It's the frequency and the timing of the finances that matter. And then finally, it's emotion. Okay, the fact is that particularly as we become more and more overwhelmed with data and information, we're finding the question, what is the right thing to do here, a particularly difficult one to answer. And so what we'll often do is we'll replace that hard question to answer, what is the right thing to do here, with a much easier question. How do I feel about this? I can answer that. And so therefore, the state and emotional affect of an audience will also have an impact on whether our influence strategy is going to be successful. And we've got two options in that instance, right? We can either choose our moment carefully. Sometimes successful influence is all about good timing. We managed to get that extra budget because our chief financial officer has just come back from a rather nice Sauvignon Blanc infueled lunch, and the figures are good, and I've just caught him at a good moment, right? He's in the right mood, he's in the right fit. So we could do that. We can do what I call, we become the mood monitor, okay, or we can become the mood maker, okay. Our friend Vlad Grizifikis at Minnesota did a really interesting set of studies. They put ads out for restaurants, okay, and one of the restaurants said, "This is the most popular restaurant in our town. Lots and lots of people enjoy coming here." They also put an ad out that said, "This is a very intimate restaurant." Same restaurant, right? And what they found was that these ads are equally effective. But then what they did was they started showing them in cinemas. And they found that it wasn't the ad itself that was actually having the influence. It was the mood that cinema goers were in the moment they saw the ad. So if they were watching like a horror movie like The Shining, they were much, much more influenced by the message of popularity. Because if you got an axe-wielding maniac running at you, and it's only you, there's a pretty good chance you're going to get slaughtered, right? But if there's 99 other people around you, you've got a fair chance of actually getting away. So you've got that's emotion driving decision. But if you just watched a rom-com, or you're out there and you're kind of infused in that, I've only got attention for this person, you're likely to be more influenced by that intimate message. And so that's it. Figure out the facts and what you compare them to. Figure out how you're going to essentially time the frequency of any financial incentives or economics that you actually use, and pay attention to the mood or the affect, if you like, the emotion of the person or the group you're interviewing. If you just do those three things, you're probably going to end up a little bit more successful than someone that doesn't. And back to being right versus being effective, okay? We don't need to be 100% right.
Right.
We don't need to be 90%. In fact, actually, you can't be 100% right, okay? You can't convince 100% of people. There are still people that live on the planet that think it's flat, for crying out loud. So, but if I'm 55 or 60% effective, if I get it, most execs, I work with a lot of chief execs and people around the world, and they're not interested in being right 9 or 10 times out of 10. They go, if I'm right 6 times out of 10, I'm likely to get promoted.
Yeah.
And I certainly won't get killed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Steve, I want to switch things up a little bit and take our conversation to a desert island.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine that you were stranded on a desert island for a year, and it's pleasant, it's not unpleasant, but you only get to take 2 catalogs of music with you, 2 musical artists' catalogs. Which 2 will you take with you?
I will take New Order, and I will take the Electric Light Orchestra.
ELO. Interesting combination.
That seems okay. Help me understand. We've talked about New Order already.
Yeah.
What does ELO bring to the desert island? What does that do for you?
There's a familiarity, but there's also a safety to it. Okay, so maybe a bit of a vulnerability now. So I went to school in the late 1970s, early 80s, and it was just an incredibly great time for music, New Romantics, end of the punk era, these kind of things. But I've always enjoyed I remember my mum and dad would play a lot of Beatles in the house, and Rolling Stones and things like this. And you can't like what your parents like when you're a kid, right? It's just, even if you do, you can't admit to it. But there was something that Jeff Lynne did after Roy Wood left and set up Wizard. And I just got really engaged, and I just really loved that kind of big orchestral theme applied to basically the Beatles 4/4 beat, right? And so Out of the Blue, New World Record, and then Discovery, these kind of things, and so I got bullied a bit when I was a kid at school and that kind of thing, and it was a it was a place I'd come back. I'd had this little record player in my bedroom, and I'd ask for the albums at Christmas and my birthday and this, that, and the other. And I just played them over and over and over again. And Jeff Lynne is an absolute hero of mine. In answer to your question earlier, would I rather have my favorite artist or my favorite actor for dinner? It would be absolutely my favorite artist, and I'd want it to be Jeff Lynne. I mean, he's a Brummy guy that's made good. Think of what the body of work now, not just in terms of what he's done with ELO, but productions with,
Traveling Wilburys,
the Beatles, the Traveling Wilburys, produced, Tom Petty, Roy Orbison. The guy is amazing, but there's something about that music, and you often hear Mr. Blue Sky because it's a very famous track that they use for soundtracks and these kind of things. So that would be my catalogue, because it has very, very fond, emotionally deep recollections of when I was at school. And then, of course, you leave school, you go to college, and suddenly you want to do cool things. And, I don't think I cared too much for Joy Division until I kind of changed my environment. And there I am with all these other kind of young kids that are kind of trying to figure out who they are, and, these kind of things. And New Order then suddenly, and then,
yeah.
I remember the first time I heard Blue Monday, I was in some ramshackle bad disco with sticky carpets and all these different kind of things. And that
context matters.
Context matters. Those are my two things.
Yeah. Steve, it is absolutely a delight to have you back on Behavioral Grooves. Thanks for being a guest today.
Lovely to see you again, Tim and Kurt. Thanks so much for your time. And please continue all the great work you do. We are all huge fans of yours.
Thank you. Welcome to our grooving session, where Tim and I share ideas and what we learned from our discussion with Steve, have a free-flowing conversation, and groove on whatever else comes into our working brains.
Our working brains. I love it.
Working brains. See, you thought I was going with influential brains, right?
I don't want to anticipate. I want it to be fresh and to experience like water flowing over you for the first time.
Oh, yes. Yeah, like water drip torture that the Chinese used to do, right? The drip, drip, that kind of torture.
It could be some kind of a water torture, yes, or waterboarding. It could be those, but it could just be fresh water from a stream of enlightenment.
My God. All right, so here's the thing. I picked working because, I mean, this is really about how do we show up at work, and how are we thinking about all of this influence, all of the work that Cialdini has done, that Steve has worked on to, have a better work life, that you are more effective. And I love the quote from the very beginning, and that he said that, it's hard pressed to find a job where influence isn't part of what you're doing. Right? Yeah. It doesn't matter if it's the main thing, but it's always there. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. It reminds me of we had a guest on that we were talking about sort of the difference between power and status within an organization, and which is better. And she said status is better. It's not so much about power, because status has a lot of that persuasive. It already comes with a certain amount of influence. And so I think that when we think about work, we've got to be thinking about how are we going to influence others, because it's a social environment. So we have to be thinking about how we're going to influence people. And I like the book's model. I really like that Steve took thousands of articles and started to zero in on the things, he pulled a Leidy Klotz on us, right? He started taking away, subtracting, pulling out all of the stuff that wasn't necessary, and really brought it down to the brass tacks. And I thought that was a good model.
Yeah. I like the fact that Leidy Klotz is now a verb, He pulled a Leidy Klotz on us. Is that right? Is that a verb, or is that a noun? What would that be?
You just got Leidy Klotzed.
Yeah. There you go. I love it. All right. So I agree. I think the model you laid out is really great. I do like the influence equation, right? That is a wonderful way of thinking about this. So look for the evidence, make an economic case, play to the emotions whenever possible, right?
Yeah.
And so, it's facts, finances, feelings, right? That's the wonderful part about this. So
Right.
evidence, economics, emotions is all E's, facts, finance, and feelings is all F. So either,
E's or F's.
either letter. My God, my tongue does not work. Okay.
Well, I mean, think about it. When you think about this, Kurt, in your own experience, in the many years that you have been consulting and pitching and persuading and talking to friendly clients and disgruntled clients and unhappy clients and people who didn't want you, and some who did want you. And I think that it just boils down to these three things: that we've got to figure out how to appeal to emotions. We've got to appeal to an economic sense. And there needs to be sort of that aspect of evidence. Without those three, it feels like that's the triumvirate that really pulls it all together.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting the way that when we think about this, we then go back to those 7 principles from Cialdini and apply those, the social proof components, the sense of, influence through authority, the consistency element, all of those that you bring back into this and you play that out. But I do like that this is bringing kind of a different perspective, a different lens, and even some different information into how we can influence things at work. Because again, if you think about the economic case and that evidence part, in our everyday life, those don't always get used, and nor should they, right?
Right.
But in our work situation, they play an oversized role. And I like that. I mean, I like that I don't like that, but I like the fact that that Steve has pulled that out and called that out.
Yeah, I agree. I also really loved, he had this really lovely pearl of wisdom in the book. And I don't know if we talked about it a lot with him in our discussion with him, but that persuasion and influence is not the same as winning arguments. Right? Like it's really good to kind of pull back from that and think that, okay, being persuasive does not necessarily mean that I'm going to win. All I want to do is persuade. I want people I want the people that I'm talking to come away with a fresher perspective.
Yeah.
Not necessarily for me to dominate them in some way, or that my ideas dominate them in some way.
Well, it goes back for me to, I think it was Annie Duke who talked about, do you want to be right? Or do you want to, get the things done? Right. And it's this idea of, are you arguing the case just to make sure that your ego stays intact and that you're proving that you have won, when the real benefit is like, no, we need to get shit done. Let's make sure that we get shit done. And it's not about you being right. It's about getting the work done. And that I like.
Which is another argument for what you just said about the downplaying the emotional side and upplaying the economic and evidentiary sides.
Yeah. All right, Mr. Houlihan. I know that you had mentioned before we got on something about incentives, because you always like to go to incentives. So
I do. I like talking about incentives, I guess, because you and I have spent a lot of time researching them and designing them and putting them into place.
Applying them in organizations and understanding how to communicate them and all of those factors. So anybody out there who needs help in incentives, talk to Tim or me.
Yes. That is true. The bus driver experiment was a really cool part of the discussion for me, because it emphasized the nuance of how we respond to incentives.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Right? Like we're not, that there's always this intuitive design that, that says, oh, people are coin operated and we just pay them money and they'll just do more of whatever we're asking them to do. But how we pay them, how we reward them, and the types of rewards that we use matter tremendously. These are not small changes. These are significant changes. And the bus driver experiment really emphasized that with paying weekly rather than just paying at the end.
So I will disagree with you on one point there, because sometimes they are very small changes, but they have an outsized impact. That, I think, is it. Paying somebody, granted, paying somebody weekly versus monthly can be you got all the HR systems, you got everything that you got to change in different pieces. Yeah. But for many things, that might not be a big thing. Paying somebody weekly versus paying somebody monthly. That can be a simple flip of the switch, right? That change drives a significant difference in their behaviors and in how they work. And there are so many times when we see this with incentives that it's the small things. How much weight are you putting on product A versus product B? And you know what? It feels like 10% isn't, if it's a 60-40 split, how much difference is it if it's 65-35? Well, that can have a massive impact.
It could.
The way that sales get measured and get reported, the way that you are reporting in and what you have to do in those aspects, all of those pieces. And as you said, the reward that you get, how much that is, it cash? Is it some other type of reward? All of those factors we know and we've seen play into how motivating, how engaging those incentives are. And as such, lend itself into how impactful they are.
Exactly. And when we're talking about impact, we're talking about productivity, we're talking about results, we're talking about outcomes of, those are the sort of the big impact results. Another thing along the incentive lines that struck me is that the fact that they did this incentive with bus drivers reminded me that it's not always salespeople or marketing people. Like, there's a whole bunch of folks who can benefit from incentives if they're designed properly. And this is not that discussion, right, for all the influences or elements of design, but a Virgin Atlantic Airlines did incentives with their pilots to help them reduce fuel. And it got them, it made a significant difference. And it was a kind of a simple nudge. I don't think it even cost anything. It was just like some checklist things and got them thinking more about the impact that had them in the disposition of, I should think about saving fuel, and things like that work.
Yeah. Well, Yana Gallus, we talked with her way back, number of years ago now too. And I remember in that conversation, this idea of extrinsic rewards, but also just the small praise, gratitude piece versus the more calculative monetary piece, and the difference that those have. And we're going to be releasing an episode real shortly again with Brad Shuck, who we've talked to a couple different times. And he talks about gratitude in that and setting up a culture of gratitude and all of these pieces. Then when you build a reward and recognition element within your organization, which is basically around what are you, can you build some incentives in? And you're right, absolutely right. It does not have to be always focused in on salespeople, although that's where we often go when we think about that. It can be about employees saving, money for the organization. It can be a cost, a savings share kind of incentive program. It can be a variety of other things. But understanding all of those nuances and getting it right is where sometimes the obvious kind of everyday way of doing something isn't always the best, which I think gets us into our final component that we want to groove on, which is, should behavioral science be a science-y thing, or should it just be layered into these other disciplines?
Right. Because Steve brought this up as a topic to say, really behavioral science should be integrated into the entire organization. It should just be layered into all the departments, and behavioral science should just be part of the way that we talk about HR and compliance and sales and marketing and innovation, all those kinds of things. And so I wanted to ask you, do you think that it should be a separate discipline? Is it better off to say, let's have the behavioral science department out here? Or
Oh,
do you think that it's more like, are you going to agree with Steve and say, no, just layer it into the organization, just make it, just
you're pushing
integrate
this
it?
on me. This is what you
Totally.
have a really strong opinion on. Now, I agree with your opinion, so I will state it, and then you can be the one who agrees. So there is an aspect of this that I think that what Steve is saying is correct. And we've talked to other people about this in the past, about this behavioral science, as Richard Thaler talks about, behavioral economics is just going to become economics. Behavioral science in work should just become part of the everyday workings of all of the different functional areas within there. People have to have a basic understanding of, loss aversion and of social proof and of some of these, and all of the influence pieces that we're just talking about here, as well as some of the other behavioral science pieces. However, and this is where I will take it back up to that incentive piece as well, right? There is a component that I think is really important of having somebody who is really steeped in the science of this and is continually exploring the science. And maybe that's a person or a group that is the experts that goes beyond kind of that functionary. I took Behavioral Science 101 and 121 in college, right? I took 2 courses on it, so now I'm an expert. No, people who have, dedicated their lives to understanding this, I think is really important, because there are these nuances, there are these contextual elements that make it really important for organizations to get right. And those small changes, like we talked about, the small changes in incentives can make a big influence on the different behaviors that are subsequently elicited.
Yeah, you and I are in a lot of agreement there, that there is this, I agree that there's this need to have an integration because organizations can benefit from applications of behavioral science completely horizontally across all the disciplines within an organization. However, if we don't have the focus and the effort put into specific research in specific areas, I think we really miss out. It's sort of like it's if you've got sort of a disease state, in your body, and you go to see an oncologist, a cancer doctor, they're going to look at it through that lens. And if you go to a infectious disease specialist, they're going to look at it through that lens, or an orthopedic person, they're going to say, well, I'm going to look at the bones, and there's, and so it's not a bad thing to have those. But when you start to integrate those, and you start saying, well, let's bring all of those, and which behavioral science is really great at integrating and amalgamating these different disciplines. When we bring those things together, I think we've got something really, really powerful and more informative for the business.
It's interesting because you use the medical example, and I will even take it a step, expand upon that metaphor one more. So, I just had prostate cancer, and in that prostate cancer diagnosis, once it was diagnosed that I had it, I went and I talked to a surgeon, who was there.
Right.
But I also talked to a radiologist, and they had it's the same disease. It's the exact same disease.
Right.
But the cure that they were both advocating for was based upon their lens. And I then we had to weigh the costs and benefits. And what I'm hearing you say is that's very, again, behavioral science can be that overarching and kind of bringing in a larger, more broad perspective on that. Is that what you would be saying?
Yeah, very much so. It's inclusive of both the radiologist and the surgeon.
Right. So it's not just like looking and saying, oh, you have cancer, or no, you have a broken bone. No, you have an infection. And by looking through that lens, it's looking at that same thing, and you have cancer, but now how do we treat this? And you're bringing in this other perspective on that. All right. So Tim, I do have this question though, because this is the piece that I think is the pushback from many within business, or even maybe Steve might have this, right? So we talk about this idea of, well, we bring accounting and finance, and, everybody has to, in business, you have to have some knowledge of finance, right? To do many of those jobs, human resources, right? You have to have many many of that. And you're kind of bringing the same idea that, hey, behavioral science is something that everybody or most people, many people within an organization should have a knowledge of, right? Mm-hmm. I don't have to be a human resource professional to understand, how to hire somebody, right? Or how to fire somebody or how to manage better or communicate inside of the organization, but they are experts in those things.
Yes.
And they often assist them. But the thing is each of those have a mandate within the organization about what they do. So accounting and finance, they have specific mandates about what they have to produce the corporate finances, right? Human resources has compliance and other things and reporting elements that they need to do. There's mandates for what they do. What is the mandate for behavioral science?
That's a really good question. It's a really good question, Kurt. And I don't have an easy answer for it. I haven't thought about it a lot, but I do. I think you point to a problem that the applied group of behavioral science folks like GABS has to struggle with. They have to wrestle with this question. I look at, there's some organizations who have cut marketing as a discipline. They've fired their chief marketing officers in the Fortune 500, big companies who have just said, we're not going to have a chief marketing officer, and kind of saying, we're going to have all these other disciplines that are going to do marketing, but we're going to look at it through a different lens. And so I think we're in an era of change that could foster either one of two things: the expansion of behavioral science and making it a discipline in and of itself, and giving behavioral science a mandate to be involved in all of the human interactions within the company and between the company and its outside constituents, or it's going to be the diminution of behavioral science. And so I could see either of those things kind of happening. Right now. How do you sit on this?
I really like what you said about that, sitting in this perspective of having the mandate around looking at human interactions, right? Behavioral science is the study of human behavior. When we think of, if in my perspective, it boils down to understanding that human behavior. I think that at a executive level, that gets shortchanged. And so I would love to see the mandate that this comes in at a design, strategic level. Not so much the application part of this is probably, to that part, maybe more built into the everyday functions, and so that you've learned how to, apply some behavioral science principles in how you write your emails and various different pieces. Yeah. But I think there's an overarching strategic lens that maybe could be that mandate that organizations could bring in. I don't know. I'm exactly like you. I haven't thought about this long enough or hard enough at this. So.
It's a good question, though, and I think we should be asking it. I'm glad that you asked it, and I'm glad that you brought it up, and I think that it deserves more discussion.
Yeah. All right, well, let's wrap this up. I personally really enjoyed catching up with Steve. I think he has a really solid book. It's always fun to talk to him. Anything else, Tim?
I just want to echo your praise and enjoyment from talking to Steve. It was just really great. Sort of some of the musical sub themes that we got into were pretty fun.
You always like the musical sub theme.
It's just kind of fun, that our guests like it. I was actually talking to somebody last night at a restaurant that we'd never met. And Katie and I are having a conversation with him, and the podcast comes up, and the question comes up, well, why do you talk to your guests about music? And it's like, well, because it gives me an insight, a lens into who those people are in a way that we never would have uncovered if we hadn't talked about music. And I think it's cool.
Yeah, it's an interesting. It breaks down, and so you've converted me over this 7 years, right? Of
How
doing
many
this.
years did it take?
Well, it only took like a couple months, but you did convert me, and I think there is something the way, and it doesn't happen with every guest, but there are some guests that when we ask these musical questions, they light up. They get a different body language, a different tone in their voice. There is an energy about them that changes. And as you said, that's a lens into who they are. And I think hopefully for our listeners that's informative as well. I know it is for us. I think anytime, I think it's also interesting with our speed round questions. We do, I think some of those do the same thing. It's a different level of understanding, a different way of looking at an individual in just the way that they answer those questions. And then the conversation that we have around it, I think is really cool. So, all right. I think we've gone on long enough on there. So for now, listeners, if you're applying behavioral science at work, take heed of Steve's words. And if you are needing to get your boss to sign off on an expensive new project, or you want to get a raise, or you need to, have a month off that's paid, check out the book. You might find some really good ways to influence your boss to give you those things that you want. And we really, really do hope that our conversation with Steve will help you this week as you go out and find your group.